This is Jonathan Yates with Wine Channel Television. Welcome to Capitol Hill for another episode of the Bipartisan Appeal of Wine with Oregon Senator Jeff Merkely. Senator, thank you for taking the time to be here.
Jonathan, it's great to be with you and great to be with you to talk about wine.
Senator, there was this movie out about the wine industry, Sideways, which had this famous line where the star said, "No more Merlot," but no one has ever said, "No more Pinot Noir." What makes Oregon wine so special?
Oh, that's right. We call it the best Pinot on the planet because it is the best Pinot Noir on the planet. It's the soils, our state soil, the Jory soil. We have a designated state soil. It's so special for the Pinot. The combination of the climate and the soil, the beautiful slopes, Yamhill Valley, terrific.
Now, wine does not grow by itself. The government and the private sector works together. What have you done to help protect the Oregon wine industry?
Well, there's been a series of issues that have come up. One is that the production of wine was being treated like the production of raw vegetables. And of course, we know that's not the case. Big difference between eating table grapes and drinking wine. And so to get that onerous red tape removed, we like red grapes, not red tape. A second was that there were folks who were trying to take and make wine outside Oregon, but pretend it was Oregon wine. So we had to shut that down.
But not ethical, to say the least.
Absolutely. Another was to get some designations for regional areas in the wine industry. So a host of different things have come up I've been able to help with.
Now, in the book by Phil Knight, the founder of Nike Shoe Dogs, he talks about how he had a problem with the government, and he went to his Oregon senators, your old boss, Senator Mark Hatfield, and they basically made the problem go away to his wonderful surprise. What have you done to help the private sector?
You get lots of calls to work on issues people are running into. For example, when I first arrived here, the wheat farmers said, "Hey, forever we've had to address a problem where we are required to switch to an interstate truck at the border, even though we're just moving our farm produce a short distance to the depot in Washington State." So I took that on, found a Republican partner, and first from Oklahoma, Senator Inhofe, and then a senator from Pennsylvania, and got that changed so people could not have to transfer their farm produce from one truck to another to go an additional distance. Or in our timber industry, developing a whole new category of mass timber where you can build 8 14-story buildings with timber rather than building it with concrete and iron. Yeah, it's a combination of strategies called cross-laminated timber and mass plywood. And so developing and funding the engineering that goes in to make that opportunity develop. But it's one thing after another, and a whole host of issues related to clean water supply and wastewater treatment and dredging our coastal ports so that the ships can get in and out. There's a lot going on in the economy and a lot I can try to help with.
So I worked up here for over a decade, and I think very highly of members of Congress. And you mentioned reaching across the aisles to work with Republicans up here to get things done. Does that happen often? Is that a daily occurrence here for you?
It happens all the time. You can pick out the most conservative members of the Republican caucus, folks that you would think I'd have nothing in common with, and there we are working together. Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, and I have championed for years the effort to make hemp farming a legal agricultural undertaking. And now we have a massive explosion of hemp farming in Oregon, producing CBD oil, for which there is a ready market. And so it's just an example. You can disagree on lots of things, but you can find something to work on together.
Now, what made you decide to go into public service?
Well, it started with the notion that we should use our life on this planet to make the place better. It's an ethic that from Boy Scouts, and it's an ethic from my church, it's an ethic from my parents. And so I was focused on public policy, originally planning to work in third world economic development, basic things like food and water and health centers and education in places around the world. I spent time in Africa and villages in Mexico, a summer in India. But then the biggest threat to the planet was nuclear war. So I worked in the 1980s on nuclear deterrence, first for Cap Weinberger in the Defense Department, of course, under a Republican president, and then for Congress. So it was that interest in policy and how it can impact things. So when I was back in Oregon, I started to work primarily on affordable housing. And that led into conversations with legislators and city council members. And I just sometimes walked away from those conversations going, you know what? Perhaps I could be more effective if I was on the other side of the table as an elected who was able to craft and put together a coalition and vote on policies rather than simply advising or encouraging legislators. So that's where the idea came from.
So you truly rose from the ranks, working as an internship, then working as a staffer, then going into state politics, and now as a member of Senator. Do you think that gives you a huge advantage over your colleagues who just ran straight for office?
Well, I think that the policy focus is a great foundation for serving in office. You're not there because you love the campaigning or the fundraising.
I've never heard that. A lot of interviews.
I didn't. I'm a blue-collar kid. I come from my father's a mechanic, a union machinist who was the mechanic who kept a sawmill operating when I was born, and then worked other jobs through life. And boy, we thought of folks who were elected to office as some distant alien, from another planet, just nothing you'd ever encounter. And to be able to work for the people of Oregon and try to make the nation and the world a better place is something I could never, ever anticipate. Even when I was working for Congress, working in the U.S. Senate and House, while helping them through the Congressional Budget Office, never occurred to me I'd ever run for congressional office and come back here.
So you grew up in a working class family. What were some of the jobs that you worked growing up that helped develop the character that's led you to the Senate?
Well, it starts with lawn mowing, but the big job in end of grade school and middle school was picking strawberries.
So you saw that legendary Oregon soil up close.
Well, that Jory soil wasn't where I was picking strawberries, but it was very good strawberry soil. The way that it worked is you'd have school buses, old school buses, that would pick you up about 4:30 in the morning. You wanted to be in the field by 5:30, basically just as early as you could.
At what age was this?
This would have been starting about age 11, and you wanted to be out there, and if you worked really hard, you could pick about 20 pounds an hour, which was about $1. So $1 an hour. It was hard work. You're bent over, you're working along the rows, and you have to be out of those fields by about 1 p.m. because as it gets warm, the berries get mushy.
It's tough to make an unpaid Capitol Hill internship look good, but that job, I think, checks that box. A friend of mine who I grew up with, one of the sharpest guys I know, he's an electrical engineer major. He was an officer with a nuclear attack sub in the Navy, started his own business, and he decided to do it in Portland, which, a lot of people would think would be just the opposite because of what you hear about the business climate in Oregon, especially Portland. But what is truly like the business climate like in Oregon from somebody who knows it from the inside and outside?
Well, Oregon has the lowest or second lowest corporate taxes in the country, and something that very few people are aware of. We have a congressional delegation that works very hard to partner to assist our industry. We're very aware that when you're in a coastal state, people have a lot of relationships overseas. They could move their companies to other places, and of course we don't want them to do that. So we want to do everything we can to facilitate business in Oregon.
So of your time in office, how have you seen the wine industry in Oregon become more professionalized?
It's just such an explosion. Now, when I was a kid, and I beseeched my mother to be able to plant things in the backyard, she said, okay, go ahead, plant whatever you want. I planted grapes, and everybody thought I was crazy. Nobody grew grapes in Oregon, not table grapes and not wine grapes. Now, I made, however, a big mistake. I only planted table grapes because that's all there was that I could find at a nursery. And I could have been one of the youngest, earliest entrepreneurs in the wine industry.
So it's only because you couldn't make it in the wine industry that you became a senator from Oregon.
Well, and I tell you, I left Oregon after high school. I came back 17 years later. And during that time period, Oregon had become a wine power. And in those years since, so it's now 28 years since I went back to Oregon, this industry has just exploded. What I find just a joy is to be able to go to any function, take with me a bottle of Oregon Pinot.
Oh yeah.
And be able to say, here's what I brought for you, and have people go, oh my goodness, my favorite Pinots from Oregon. And it's just such a well-received gift.
So what was it like growing up in a working class family and talking about politics at the dinner table? Do you think that gave you an advantage?
Well, I'll tell you how it worked. My father, as a mechanic, had pretty regular hours, occasionally overtime, but pretty regular hours. So we'd have dinner at 5. and then would proceed to sit in the living room and watch the evening news. And of course, at that time, you didn't have social media. And the evening news was a moment where my father would say, well, then that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. He'd argue over the things going on the television. And I would chime in and try to find ways to disagree with him, just, because I'm a teenager, and
Sure.
you want to try to find ways to disagree. And so that was a great education I had with my father there, observing world affairs after dinner.
And so how do you think that prepared you for school at Princeton and Stanford?
Well, it gave me an interest in the world, and my folks were always encouraging me to explore the world. When I was in high school, when I was 16, I signed up to be considered for a student exchange program called American Field Service, or AFS. And our school would sponsor one student a year, and we had a very large high school. It was 3,200 kids, and I thought, oh, I would really love to do that. The chance to go somewhere I'd never otherwise be able to go. And with a little bit of good fortune and preparation, I was selected, and I was sent to West Africa, to Ghana. And 6 students went from the United States to West Africa. And of those 6, 5 went to affluent families and cities, and I was sent to a very humble family in a small town. Now that family's 2 big prized possessions were an iron. They happened to have an electrical outlet because my host father taught for the public school, and they had provided a concrete house, very simple concrete house, and a bicycle. So when you are with a family and the 2 big things they own are one bicycle
Yes.
and an iron, that is a very different world. When I left and went overseas that summer at 16, I viewed my family as of very modest means. I came back and saw all that we were fortunate to have, to be able to own a car, a television, have a garage, essentially a home for a car, to be able to go camping on vacation, to have the money to be able to do that. And suddenly my blue-collar family looked fabulously rich. It's left me a lifelong appreciation of everything that we're fortunate to have.
It's interesting you bring up the bicycle. There's a book called The Land of Second Chances, where a bicyclist from the West Coast went to Rwanda. And when he got there, he was, just amazed at how important bicycles were to the economy of the country, and that how uplifting and positive the people were, even though they had had the horrible genocide. And so he just appreciated the African outlook on life. What did you get from this time you spent in Ghana?
Well, I tell you, I was surrounded by families where they lived on $1 a day. I remember speaking with one father. He had 6 or 7 children, and he said, listen, on my $1 a day, I can buy the equivalent of a plantain, a large banana, for each child. And that's it. That's my whole income. So every child has to work. That is a very different world. So kids, instead of going to school, were selling candy through the bus windows in the middle of town, or making bread and hawking it door to door, or a whole host of things. People were really scrapping for survival. And they had no health care, they had no insurance, they had no bank account, they had many of the trappings that we take for granted of middle-class life would be just so foreign to them. But what I found is people who had very positive outlooks on life, who are helping their neighbors, helping their friends. Maybe it's a little bit when you know the challenges,
Sure.
You're ready to help others, knowing that collectively people do better.
So do you think that summer changed you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It first of all gave me that real strong interest in working in economic development overseas. So it led to my experience in villages. It led to working in India. It certainly led to studying international relations in college and economic development in graduate school. It was most unexpected that just as I was saving money I was working at the World Bank as an intern. I was saving money to be able to go back and work in the field in Africa when I was offered the position to work on nuclear deterrence issues with Cap Weinberger. That was totally unexpected. And had nuclear war not been the biggest threat to the planet, it's a pivot I would never have made. I much preferred the idea of working with struggling people overseas than working on military issues. But But sometimes you have moral responsibility on things that threaten our planet, and I tried to address and honor that.
You know, one thing that's been interesting about, these series of interviews with members of Congress is, you find out the different issues around the country that you didn't expect. I'm from the East Coast, the D.C. area, and in interviewing West Coast members about the wine industry, it's kind of interesting how important water is as an issue out west. How important is water as an issue for you in Oregon?
Well, when I was a child, I kept hearing the saying that it is basically whiskey is for drinking, and water, that's for fighting. And that saying comes from the fact that water is essential to ranching and to agriculture and to our cities. Everybody needs it. So even in a state with a lot of rain, water is a truly prized possession, so essential to the wine community. And there's another aspect in Oregon that we really have to wrestle with, and that's forest fires. As climate change is making our seasons hotter and longer, our forests are burning, and this last year we had the challenge of a significant amount of wine grapes that were tainted by smoke from the forest fires, and therefore couldn't be used. So working on forest policy and trying to reduce the risk of forest fires is another piece of working to help the wine industry.
It's one of those things people on the East Coast just don't realize about the West Coast. Like I said, I grew up in the D.C. area, and I lived in Kirkland one summer, and I thought, I'll drive out to Montana and, swing back through Idaho and Oregon and try to make it back for dinner. And then you look at the map and you realize, well, that's not going to happen. What are the other things people from the East Coast don't realize about what it's like out west?
They're always surprised about the size of the states.
Yes.
I was out this last weekend holding town halls up in the very northeast corner of the state in Wallowa County, down in the southwest corner in Josephine County, and there's a lot of miles in between. You can have places in Oregon, it can take you 7 hours to drive from one place to another, and that's just not something.
That's 4 states.
Or maybe 8 on the East Coast here.
So, you worked your way up through politics. Do you think, working your way up through the House and everything gives you sort of an advantage? I mean, I worked as a chief of staff for a member of the Massachusetts General Court when I lived in Boston. And, if you think the resources are sparse in Congress for staff, check out a state legislature, particularly a part-time state legislature. So do you think that sort of gave you sort of an institutional advantage in that, you were forced to move things on your own as a state legislator and couldn't rely on staff?
Well, it's very true. We had the equivalent of 1 to 2 staff members, depending on how you allocated your budget while you were in session.
As a part-time legislature, right?
As a part-time
90
legislature.
days?
So, no, actually about 6 months.
6 months, okay.
And Oregon's now gone to 5 months 1 year, and then a kind of a tune-up 1 month the following year. And then I think it was a half-time person working for you during the 18 months in between. And so means you're really on your own. You have a facilitator taking phone calls and notes and filing, and that's great. But you've got to drive your own agenda, determine how you're going to work on issues, build your relationships with other legislators, work with the team to lay out a legislative plan. So it's very much hands-on. It might take you back to a time when there were no Senate office buildings here on Capitol Hill, and your office was your chair on the floor. And you had your desk, and that was your office. And maybe you had somebody helping you, maybe a personal secretary, but not all senators had that. And so it's much more like the early stage of the U.S. Senate if you turn the clock back a couple hundred years.
From working with your staff up here, you have an excellent staff. I mean, has that been a tough transition for you from, doing things hands-on to having such a great staff up here and having the whole world as sort of your constituency now?
No, that's not been too tough a transition because I ran nonprofits. And so I had teams that I was working with. And then when I was Democratic leader, I had a team working for the Democratic caucus. So when I became Speaker, I had a larger team. So it was a transition over time, so that wasn't a huge leap. I can tell you what was hard was when I first ran for the Senate, letting somebody else drive while I worked. and made phone calls.
Yes.
That was
Well, getting
really
those teenage
hard.
interns driving, that's a
I
lot
do
of
not
fun.
trust anyone else driving a car, and to
So do you own
relinquish
Tesla
that-
stock now for that, to get that automatic car?
No, I think the Tesla is out of reach in our household. That's a whole other conversation we can have about the need to transition to renewable energy,
Sure.
electricity, solar energy, and wind energy to replace fossil fuels. That's a very important thing. We have to do it quickly because, as I mentioned, climate change is affecting Oregon.
Sure.
Those fires and that smoke, that's a problem. The ocean acidification is a problem. The smaller snowpack in the Cascades, less irrigation water for farming and ranching, that's a problem. So we have a lot of concerns, and since you mentioned that, I just have to say that's something we all have to work on very intensely.
You know, Oregon as a state punches above its weight class in wine, that is for sure. You have over 700 wineries, and you produce 7 million gallons of still wine a year. So, and in addition, Oregon State University is only one of 5 schools to have an undergraduate program in winemaking. So it seems like the state wants wine to be shared by everyone, not just the elite. What is your favorite Oregon wine memory, Senator?
Well, I think it's taking my wife's family when they're visiting out to Yamhill County and sitting on a beautiful landscape in late summer. Because we passed a bill, actually it was an initiative to save our land use system in Oregon. We have a unique system. So we have essentially a border around the cities, a virtual border. And outside of that, it's agricultural and forest land that's taxed at a much lower rate, but it can't be developed. You can't put housing on it. And so when you go out to our wine country, you might think you're in Italy. You see these rolling hills, beautiful vineyards, and you're just like, this is fabulous. Why didn't somebody want to put a development right there?
Townhouses will look great.
They can't do it, so because we protected that. And so taking Mary's family out to enjoy the wine, enjoy sitting in the sunshine on those slopes and just in paradise. That's and I invite everyone, by the way. If you haven't come to Oregon to experience paradise, come
If it was
soon.
a 45-minute drive from Kirkland, I would have. But hey, Senator, it's been fabulous, and it's time to put this cork on this episode of the Bipartisan Appeal of Wine. Thank you very much for taking the time, sir. This is
Thank you
Jonathan
very
Yates
much.
with Wine Channel Television. Thank you for taking the time to watch the episode.